Come on.
The black soil farming country of Inverell in northern New South Wales is coming alive. The drought has broken, but retired National Senator John Wacker Williams
The creek is still not running.
says the rain is not the only source of relief for local farmers.
I must admit the banks have had a pretty good turnaround to their behaviour and the way they've been treating their customers.
For many farmers, the hardest part of the rolling droughts over the past 2 decades was not the dry itself, but how they were treated by lenders.
Once you defaulted, the drought came along, you had a bad season, you had bad commodity prices and you couldn't make your payment to the bank. Sorry bank, I can't pay, you'll have to wait. Then the penalty rates would be put into place. And that just hastened the demise of the farmers.
They drove some farmers off the land where the farm had been in the family for generations, in some cases over 100 years.
But over the past few years, something has changed.
2019, it was a terrible drought, the driest year on record here where I lived since 1878. Well, this time in the 2019 drought, I don't know of any banks that actually charged penalty interest rates, and I don't know of any farming family that was sold up. So I can see a big change, more tolerance, obviously brought about by the publicity, the bad publicity, the media strength and the Royal Commission.
Since March last year, banks are not allowed to charge default interest on farmers in drought, bringing some closure to the issue that drove Wacker Williams to take on the banks in the first place.
And it is time this country had a Royal Commission into white-collar crime.
He was a key political figure in the push for a Royal Commission.
The Australian people want a Royal Commission into the banks.
The calls grew louder during the Turnbull government as a series of scandals racked the industry,
failing to report more than 50,000 suspicious cash deposits.
But the then PM and his Treasurer, Scott Morrison, fiercely resisted.
We have, as a government, decided not to have a Royal Commission.
Only grudgingly agreeing when Williams and other Nationals forced their hand.
Well, government's policy remains the same until it's changed.
The limited terms of reference were seen as a reflection of the government's unwillingness to expose the banks and financial advisors to criticism. But even those limits were not enough to stop damaging stories emerging.
Fees for no service, taking money for nothing, unsolicited cold calls, knowingly charging dead customers.
Royal Commissioner Ken Hayne eventually handed down a scathing report which made 76 recommendations, putting pressure on the government for legislative reforms, regulators to lift their game, and banks and other financial institutions to change their culture and make recompense to customers.
Today, we have said we're taking action on all 76 recommendations.
But 2 years on, the Morrison government effectively overruled the key recommendation that banks stick by the so-called responsible lending obligations. The government argued the rules, which put more responsibilities on lenders to make sure borrowers could really afford their loans, were making loans too hard to get, particularly in an economy hit by a global pandemic, and moved to dump them.
Well, I wouldn't have done it if I was part of the government. I'd have pushed for the old system to stay in place.
Since those laws were introduced 10 years ago, there have been more than 100 pages of additional regulations and regulatory guidance.
Those changes to lending rules aren't the only reforms still before the Parliament. Others are yet to be introduced. The government has not banned a kind of commission that mortgage brokers are sometimes paid for years over the course of a loan, but might reconsider in 2022. As for the rest of the 76 recommendations, the level of progress depends on who you ask. There is a broad agreement that nearly 30 have been completed, but others are less clear-cut. A ban on pushy sales tactics, including the selling of financial products through unsolicited phone calls, has been legislated but doesn't take effect until October. Others, like the call for a last resort compensation scheme for people ripped off by financial advisors, are yet to be legislated. The government has extended its deadline by 6 months due to COVID, and now has until June to introduce its planned legislation. But the COVID excuse has its limits. The recommendation for a compensation scheme actually predates the Royal Commission and has been on the Treasurer's desk since 2017.
The government says they're still committed to it, but where is it? The recommendation has now been with the government for more than 3 years.
Perhaps the most important issue, however, is how the banks have responded in practical terms and started to change the culture that led to problems in the first place. Banks and financial institutions have had to employ an army of assessors to deal with badly treated customers and make settlements. By mid-last year, the Big Four, plus Macquarie and AMP, had paid out just over $1 billion in compensation to customers who had charged fees for no service or given dodgy advice. In August, ASIC told the Parliament the total remediation bill could be nearly $4 billion. How important has the practical aspects of remediation been to changing bank culture?
Each of the four major banks have roughly about 1,000 people each working on remediation. Perhaps one of the most important is the changes to the way that frontline staff are paid. Over the last 2 years, banks have abolished direct sales targets.
There's no doubt that COVID has played a role in some delay here. But in other instances, COVID actually highlights the need for consumer protections and the need for some of these changes.
The banks will have to sell businesses up. There will be some go. But hopefully, when they do exit, the banks don't bankrupt them, show them compassion, let them get on with their lives, because it's not their fault they went broke when COVID-19 hit Australia. Good dogs.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 730's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.